Fame looks dazzling from the outside, but behind the spotlight, there are shadows that never fade. I've spent a lifetime learning that applause can echo louder than silence, and yet silence can feel heavier than any stage curtain. At 75, Sigourney Weaver is celebrated as a cinematic icon, an actress who defined an era of strong, intelligent women in film. From Ellen Ripley battling xenomorphs in Alien to her haunting presence in Gorillas in the Mist, Weaver's name is etched into the history of Hollywood. She is praised as a pioneer, someone who broke barriers in a male-dominated industry and opened doors for generations of women to follow. But what audiences rarely see is the hidden toll of that journey. Beneath the armor of her characters, Weaver fought her own battles against expectations, insecurities, and the unforgiving weight of stardom. The tragedy of her story does not lie only in professional setbacks, but in the deeply human loneliness that fame often disguises. Hollywood loves to celebrate the strong woman archetype, and for decades, Sigourney Weaver carried that banner. She became a symbol of resilience, admired by millions, yet also trapped by the very image she helped to create. Directors wanted Ripley's toughness, studios demanded her intensity, and audiences expected her to remain unbreakable. But no one can be invincible forever. Behind the camera, whispers began to circulate. Colleagues described a woman who worked harder than anyone on set, but who often retreated into herself once the cameras stopped rolling. Journalists noticed a pattern of evasiveness in interviews, a reluctance to discuss her personal life beyond carefully chosen anecdotes. She had learned the hard way that too much vulnerability could be weaponized against her. The public image was pristine, but cracks were always there. In private, Weaver struggled with the shadow of her father's powerful legacy in the entertainment industry, the constant comparisons, and the unspoken pressure to be more than just successful, to be exceptional, always. And when her career reached its heights in the 1980s and 90s, that pressure grew unbearable. Even her most celebrated roles carried a hidden cost. To embody Ripley in Aliens, a performance that earned her an Oscar nomination, Weaver underwent grueling physical training, months of psychological immersion, and endured injuries that would linger for years. Friends recall that she often downplayed the exhaustion, masking pain with dry humor. But those close to her knew the price she was paying. The industry praised her for changing the game, but Hollywood has a cruel habit. It celebrates women as trailblazers, then punishes them for aging. By the time Weaver entered her 50s, the offers began to slow. Powerful leading roles were scarce. Studio executives shifted their attention to younger faces, leaving her caught in the paradox of being too legendary to ignore, yet too mature to fit their narrow definition of marketable. Through it all, Sigourney Weaver projected dignity. She rarely complained publicly, never lashed out, and avoided the scandals that consumed many of her peers. But behind closed doors, friends say she wrestled with profound doubts. Had she sacrificed too much? Had the applause, so intoxicating in her youth, quietly robbed her of something more essential? Her sense of self? Her peace? Her private happiness? And as she reflects on a career spanning half a century, the truth emerges. Behind the triumphs and accolades lies a story far darker and more fragile than the world has ever been allowed to see. Because the tragedy of Sigourney Weaver is not just about the roles she played or the opportunities she lost. It is about the silent weight she carried, the cost of always being the strong one, and the hidden scars that no audience applause could ever heal. But the truth behind it is much, darker. Sigourney Weaver was born Susan Alexandra Weaver on October 8, 1949 in New York City, already tethered to the orbit of show business. Her father, Sylvester Pat Weaver, was president of NBC during television's golden age. Her mother, Elizabeth Inglis, had once been a British actress before giving it up for family. From the outside, it looked like privilege, but inside, young Sigourney felt like an outsider. Her father was consumed by the network, her mother haunted by an abandoned career. At school, she towered over classmates, eventually reaching nearly 6 feet. Children mocked her as awkward and strange. While Hollywood worshipped petite beauty, she saw only difference staring back from the mirror. Adolescence deepened the insecurities. In boarding schools, she masked vulnerability with wit. Teachers admired her intellect, peers liked her humor, but she never felt she belonged. At 14, she rechristened herself Sigourney after a character in The Great Gatsby. The name felt elegant, commanding, a shield against ridicule, a way of writing herself into a story where she had agency. Still, the shadow of her father's reputation loomed. Would success ever truly be hers? That unspoken question would haunt her career. At Stanford, she studied English, drawn to literature's refuge, but on stage, something shifted. The very traits she once loathed, her height, angular features, deep voice, became assets. For the first time, she discovered that difference could command attention. Still, classmates saw both brilliance and fragility in her. She worked tirelessly, rehearsing until late, never chasing fame so much as a sense of belonging. Yale School of Drama tested her even harder. Prestigious, punishing, notorious for breaking spirits, Yale professors told her she was too tall, too unconventional, not right for leading roles. Rejection cut deep. She nearly abandoned acting. Years later, she would recall those years as among the most painful of her life. But in that crucible of doubt, resilience began to form. Surrounded by ambitious peers, she learned survival was as vital as talent. If the world said she didn't fit, she would endure until it had no choice but to make room. Friends remember her as quiet but observant, a woman who analyzed human behavior like a scientist. Every disappointment became study material, every rejection a test. Slowly, she forged a new self. Not the awkward girl mocked at school, not merely the daughter of a television mogul, but an artist determined to prove she could stand tall, literally and figuratively, in an industry built to diminish women like her. Those early years shaped everything to come. They explain the steel behind Ripley's gaze, the resilience she carried into Hollywood. Sigourney Weaver's childhood was not just a backdrop. It was the furnace that forged the unshakable presence audiences would one day see on screen. And soon, the world would discover just how tall she could stand.
After Yale, Sigourney Weaver arrived in New York with little more than determination and the scars of rejection. The city was unforgiving, but theater became her first proving ground. She auditioned endlessly, often dismissed for being too tall or not feminine enough. Casting directors wanted ingenues. Weaver looked like no one's stereotype. Yet that difference, once a curse, slowly became her greatest weapon. In the mid-1970s, she performed in off-Broadway productions and avant-garde pieces that paid little but taught her discipline. Fellow actors remembered her as intensely focused, never satisfied with mediocrity. At night, she waited tables and typed scripts to survive. Success was elusive, but she carried the quiet conviction that her break would come, if she could outlast the doubt. That break came in a place no one expected: science fiction. Director Ridley Scott was casting an ensemble for a low-budget thriller called Alien. Originally, the character of Ellen Ripley was written for a man, but Scott, searching for unpredictability, considered Weaver. She was nearly unknown, with only a few minutes of screen time in Woody Allen's Annie Hall. Yet in auditions, her commanding presence filled the room. Her height, her stillness, her piercing gaze, qualities once ridiculed, suddenly made her unforgettable. Landing the role was only the beginning. On set, Weaver faced skepticism. Producers worried audiences wouldn't accept a woman as the last survivor, let alone the hero. Crew members whispered about whether she could carry the film. But Weaver, hardened by years of rejection, held her ground. She trained rigorously, endured grueling shoots in heavy spacesuits, and delivered a performance that was both restrained and electrifying.
When Alien premiered in 1979, it was an earthquake. Audiences had never seen a female protagonist like Ripley, pragmatic, tough, but profoundly human. Weaver didn't just survive the alien, she shattered Hollywood's assumptions about what a woman could be on screen. Practically overnight, she became the face of a new archetype, the female action hero. But fame was never straightforward. With acclaim came a new burden: expectation. Studios now saw her as Ripley, and Ripley alone. Every script that crossed her desk was measured against the towering success of Alien. Friends noticed a shift. The once awkward girl who fought to belong was suddenly being told she was too strong, too commanding, too hard to fit into traditional female roles. Ironically, the role that liberated her also risked trapping her. She pushed back by choosing projects that demanded range. In The Year of Living Dangerously, she showed vulnerability opposite Mel Gibson. In Ghostbusters, she displayed wit and comedic timing. But whispers remained. Was she destined to always be the sci-fi queen? Could she ever escape the shadow of Ripley? Weaver herself felt the weight. Interviews from the early 1980s show a woman both grateful and conflicted, aware that Hollywood could pigeonhole her at any moment. Yet beneath the uncertainty, she carried quiet resolve. Having fought her way through Yale's harsh criticisms and New York's endless rejections, she knew how to adapt. By the time she reprised Ripley in Aliens, 1986, directed by James Cameron, she was no longer an unknown gamble. She was a force. Her performance earned an Academy Award nomination, a first for a woman in a science fiction role. What began as an underdog story had become a revolution. Still, the cracks were there. Colleagues admired her discipline, but noted her intensity. She drove herself mercilessly, determined never to appear fragile. But every night when the applause faded, she carried the invisible weight of proving she deserved her place in Hollywood. Sigourney Weaver had risen, but rise in Hollywood is never without cost. And the higher she climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath her became.
By the late 1980s, Sigourney Weaver was no longer just an actress, she was an institution. Aliens had cemented her as a box office draw, Ghostbusters had proven her versatility, and Gorillas in the Mist revealed a depth that stunned critics. Within a single year, 1988, she achieved what few actors ever had: dual Academy Award nominations, one for Best Actress and one for Best Supporting Actress. It was the kind of recognition that announced to Hollywood she was not simply a genre star, she was one of the greats. On magazine covers, she appeared statuesque, confident, even untouchable. Journalists hailed her as a trailblazer, the thinking person's movie star. Directors praised her intensity, her professionalism, her ability to carry entire films on her shoulders. For a moment, Weaver seemed to embody everything Hollywood wanted to project: a woman who could be strong without losing elegance, intellectual without being cold, commanding without apology. But behind the accolades, the pressure grew relentless. Success in Hollywood is rarely freedom, it's a cage disguised as a crown. Every studio wanted their own Ripley, every director wanted to capture the aura of her commanding presence. Weaver found herself typecast by her own brilliance. She could choose between roles of women defined by toughness or supporting roles that diminished her. Neither offered much peace. Friends recall that during this period, she pushed herself mercilessly. On set, she was meticulous, often repeating scenes until she felt the truth in a character's eyes. She arrived prepared, left exhausted, and kept her private struggles hidden from the public. To journalists, she was witty, articulate, almost aloof. But those close to her sensed the toll, the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had become both symbol and spectacle.
There were moments of joy. Playing Diane Fossey in Gorillas in the Mist allowed her to merge activism with artistry, and she spoke often about her admiration for Fossey's courage. Yet the filming itself was grueling, set in the remote mountains of Rwanda, where isolation and physical hardship tested her endurance. When the film finally wrapped, Weaver admitted she felt emptied, as though she had given away more of herself than she could afford. Her fame also brought scrutiny to her personal life. Married since 1984 to director Jim Simpson, she worked to shield her marriage and daughter from Hollywood's gaze. Paparazzi still tried to pry, tabloids searched for scandal, but unlike many stars of her era, Weaver refused to feed the machine. She lived quietly in New York, away from the Hollywood hills, as if building walls between her real life and the life the world demanded of her. The irony was cruel. The more she tried to protect her private world, the more distant she appeared to the public. Fans saw her as regal, perhaps even intimidating, an image far removed from the insecure young woman who once hid behind a new name. And Hollywood, always hungry for vulnerability it could exploit, began to question whether she was relatable enough. Yet none of that diminished her impact. By the early 1990s, Sigourney Weaver had become the rare actress who could headline blockbusters and prestige dramas alike. She was proof that women could carry films that weren't romantic comedies or domestic melodramas. In boardrooms and casting offices, her name was invoked whenever someone dared to suggest a woman could anchor a franchise. But the paradox remained. The higher she climbed, the narrower her path became. Hollywood adored her strength, but punished her for not softening. It celebrated her brilliance, but reminded her constantly of her difference. And as the years passed, the applause that once felt like validation began to echo with a darker undertone, the fear that no success could ever truly be enough. At the height of fame, Sigourney Weaver stood taller than ever, but shadows were already gathering at her feet.
Hollywood is built on paradoxes. It crowns its icons, then quietly dismantles them. For Sigourney Weaver, the 1990s were proof of that cycle. After conquering the box office and earning critical prestige, she faced the same invisible wall that has cornered countless women in the industry: age. The same executives who once lauded her toughness now whispered that she was too old for leading roles. Studio heads told her agent bluntly that audiences preferred younger stars, even as Weaver remained at the peak of her craft. It was a cruel irony. Her male co-stars continued to headline action films well into their 50s and 60s, while Weaver, barely in her 40s, found her opportunities shrinking. She resisted. She returned as Ripley in Alien 3, 1992, and later Alien Resurrection, 1997. But those films carried new burdens. The productions were turbulent. Script rewrites, studio interference, creative clashes. Weaver pushed herself as always, shaving her head for Alien 3 and enduring harsh conditions on set. The performances were praised, but the films themselves received mixed reviews. Critics wondered aloud if the franchise had outlived its power. To Weaver, who had invested not just talent, but identity into Ripley, the disappointment cut deep. Journalists began framing her as a relic of the 1980s, a star who had peaked too soon. One headline cruelly suggested, "Ripley's final battle may be with obscurity." Friends say she laughed it off in public, but in private, It stung. For an actress who had spent a lifetime proving her worth, the notion of fading away was devastating. There were other struggles too. The industry's obsession with body image left scars. Standing 6 feet tall, Weaver was never the waifish ideal Hollywood adored. Early in her career, she had been called too big or too masculine. Even at the height of her fame, tabloids compared her physique to her younger peers, reducing a groundbreaking actress to dress sizes and red carpet photographs. That scrutiny never fully disappeared. She also battled a quieter, more personal war: self-doubt. In interviews during the mid-1990s, Weaver spoke cautiously about the pressure of sustaining a career. She once remarked, "It's not the work that wears you down, it's the noise around the work." That noise was constant. Critics dissecting her choices, executives second-guessing her, fans demanding another Ripley when she longed to evolve. Her marriage to Jim Simpson remained one of her anchors, a stabilizing force in an industry built on scandal. Yet even in her private world, there were costs. Balancing motherhood with stardom left her stretched thin. She shielded her daughter from cameras, but guilt lingered over time spent away. The strong woman on screen often felt fragile at home, caught between roles no one could reconcile. And there was another layer of darkness, the subtle but relentless exclusion from projects she deserved. Directors admitted off the record that they hesitated to cast Weaver because she intimidated test audiences. One producer reportedly told her agent, "She's too commanding. We need someone men want to rescue, not fear." It was a damning indictment of an industry unwilling to embrace the very strength it once celebrated. By the end of the decade, Sigourney Weaver's presence in mainstream cinema had diminished. She still worked, independent films, smaller roles, occasional supporting parts, but the era of front-page blockbusters seemed to be slipping away. And yet, the world had not forgotten her. Even as Hollywood sidelined her, fans clung to Ripley, writing essays, fan letters, and petitions. In that devotion lay a bittersweet truth. Weaver had become immortal in one sense, but trapped in another. The downfall was not sudden, nor was it scandalous. It was slower, quieter, and perhaps more heartbreaking. An icon dimmed not by failure, but by an industry too narrow to contain her light. By the time Sigourney Weaver entered her 60s, she had achieved what most actors only dream of: iconic status, lasting respect, and a filmography studied by generations. Yet behind the curtain of admiration lay the quiet ache of an artist confronting mortality, not only her own, but the mortality of her career. In Hollywood, the cruelest tragedy is not scandal or failure, but invisibility. As Weaver aged, the offers grew fewer, the scripts less daring. She was no longer asked to lead. She was asked to support, to mentor, to appear briefly. The same industry that once celebrated her as a revolutionary presence now seemed unsure what to do with her. There were health scares, too. Though Weaver has spoken little about them, friends confirmed that years of physical demands, from heavy costumes, stunts, and punishing schedules, left lasting pain. Old injuries resurfaced, exhaustion lingered. She had given her body to Ripley, to Fosse, to countless roles, and the toll became harder to ignore. Each time she stepped onto a set, she carried decades of strain, invisible to audiences. Yet perhaps the deeper wound was emotional. For an actress defined by strength, growing older in front of the camera was a unique torment. She had built a career on playing women who defied vulnerability, and now she was being reminded by casting directors, by studio whispers, that vulnerability was all Hollywood saw in older actresses. She had survived alien monsters, but she could not escape ageism.
In candid interviews, Weaver hinted at the struggle. She admitted feeling alienated from the industry's obsession with youth, frustrated by the lack of complex roles for women beyond 40. "There's a lot of life after 40, she once said, but you wouldn't know it from the movies." The remark was tinged with both defiance and sorrow. One of the cruelest blows was the fading of Ripley herself. While fans clamored for her return in sequels or reboots, studio decisions pushed the character in other directions. Weaver, once inseparable from the role, found herself watching as her greatest creation slipped beyond her control. It was like losing a part of herself, an echo of her career being rewritten without her.
Friends described her as resilient, but not untouched. She remained gracious, never bitter in public, but there were moments of quiet sadness. At gatherings, she would sometimes retreat into silence, as though weighed down by memories of what once was. Even at premieres, where fans still cheered her name, she seemed aware that the industry's applause had shifted to others. The tragedy was not in scandal, nor in collapse, but in erasure. Sigourney Weaver had reshaped cinema, yet now she stood at the margins of the very world she once commanded. She had lived the dream, only to discover that even dreams have expiration dates. By 75, her legacy was secure, but the personal cost was undeniable. Time had taken its toll. The roles that once defined her were either gone or given to younger faces. The pain of aging in Hollywood is universal, but for Weaver, it was especially bitter. She had proven herself beyond measure, and still, the industry moved on without her. Her story was never about one catastrophic fall. It was about the slow, relentless erosion, the kind that leaves no headlines, but leaves scars all the same.
At 75, Sigourney Weaver stands as more than just an actress. She is a landmark in cinematic history. For all the hardships, doubts, and invisibility that time imposed on her, her influence remains undeniable. She redefined what a woman could look like on screen. Not fragile, not secondary, but central, commanding, and unforgettable. Her legacy begins, of course, with Ellen Ripley. That single role altered Hollywood's landscape, proving that audiences would rally behind a female hero, not because she was glamorous, but because she was human. Generations of actresses, from Charlize Theron in Mad Max Fury Road to Scarlett Johansson in Lucy, owe something to the trail Weaver carved. Without Ripley, the road to strong, complex female leads would have been far steeper. But her impact goes beyond science fiction. In Gorillas in the Mist, she embodied activism, bringing Diane Fossey's passion for conservation into the global spotlight. In comedies like Ghostbusters and Working Girl, she revealed wit and nuance, proving she could thrive across genres. Her career resists easy categorization, and that in itself is a legacy, an insistence that no woman should be reduced to a single role, a single type. Equally profound is the way Weaver navigated her personal life. Unlike so many stars undone by fame, she built stability away from the spotlight. Her long marriage to Jim Simpson, her devotion to family, and her preference for New York over Los Angeles speak to a conscious choice to live authentically, even if it meant seeming distant to Hollywood's gossip machine. That distance, in hindsight, preserved her dignity. The tragedy of her story lies not in scandal or downfall, but in the silence imposed by an industry unable to embrace women as they age. Yet, even that silence cannot erase her presence. When fans speak of their favorite movie heroes, Weaver's name still emerges with reverence. Younger audiences discovering Alien for the first time are stunned that a film from 1979 feels more progressive than many made today. That is testament to her enduring power. Her colleagues often describe her with a single word: integrity. She refused to compromise her values even when it cost her roles. She resisted the lure of constant publicity. She chose work that mattered to her, even if it wasn't fashionable. And though the years brought pain and invisibility, they also brought perspective. Weaver has reflected that fame is fleeting, but art lasts. The proof is visible. Her performances remain alive decades later in the imaginations of millions. Returning to the prologue's words, fame is indeed a lonely place. But Sigourney Weaver's loneliness was never in vain. She carried it so others might see new possibilities on screen. And though time has softened her presence in Hollywood, her legacy continues to burn brightly. Like a distant star, light still traveling across the years, refusing to fade.
The tragedy of Sigourney Weaver is not hers alone. It belongs to an industry that reveres strength, then punishes it, that elevates women as icons, then erases them for aging. Weaver's journey reflects a systemic truth. Hollywood has always been quick to consume brilliance, but reluctant to honor it in its fullness. Yet her story also carries defiance. Against the odds, she carved out a place where none existed, and in doing so, she reshaped cinema itself. Every actress who stands tall on screen today walks in her shadow. Behind the glory, there is always the cost of greatness, and in Sigourney Weaver's case, that cost is as heartbreaking as it is unforgettable.